I'm setting off on a crossing from the Isle of Skye to Harris, the Outer Hebrides. It's a journey of 15 miles that has taken place by people for over 9,700 years. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers went to the island perhaps as summer hunting, perhaps longer. A site at Rum is one of the earliest in the British Isles and the earliest discovered in Scotland. About 5,500 years ago, a new colonist turned up, and it's their ancestors that would go on to build Britain's most remote stone circle several hundred years later. The new stone users were agriculturists. Originating in Syria, they colonized Europe slowly, displacing the native hunter-gatherers over thousands of years. I explain their expansion in more detail in another video, and you can find a link for that below. Callanish stones were erected around 5,000 years ago, and probably to replace a timber circle. And they still draw a crowd, whether to simply see one of the few attractions on the island of Harris and Lewis, or to ponder its mysteries, or simply to soak up the beauty of the location. I can't tell you the function of these monuments, no one can. We can of course guess and come up with our own theories. And whilst there is some evidence that the stones may record the 18-year lunar cycle as it rises and sets in different locations, there are simply so many stones forming so many alignments. It could have mapped the heavens, or it could be used for something else, or multiple functions over its 1,500 or so years of active use. Given the limitations of our knowledge, I'm going to approach this subject in a different way, to see it as part of the landscape and human existence. If you are unfamiliar with one of Britain's most remote island communities of Harris and Lewis, they are one island and it's about 60 miles north to south, so it's not small. Harris is distinguished as being mountainous and Lewis is a little flatter. The main community, Stornoway, feels deceptively like any large Highland town, and all the modern facilities you would expect. But for the rest of the island and the smaller communities, life goes on as it has done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Crofting, fishing, socialising, sports, and the local church, Presbyterians, unique to Scotland, where the hymns are sung in Gaelic, and it's still part of life. Hebrideans, of course, have electricity, broadband, 4G, a modern hospital, and are connected to the wider world. A century ago, it was a whole lot more primitive, and Hebrideans then and now have to cope with long winter nights, the Atlantic climate, which is never very cold but always windy, and always changeable. And that's been a constant since people first set foot on these islands, a little after the ice sheets retreated. Crofting has been the main activity since the first farmers landed over 5,000 years ago, raising sheep and cattle. These highland cattle are distant descendants of the small Neolithic breed they introduced, although the ancient sheep they brought have more in common with the small CO.AG sheep, native to the tiny Westerly Hebridean island of St Kilda. The little houses of these islands, often abandoned like snail shells as people moved into more modern accommodation in recent decades, are similar to the Iron Age homes from 2,000 years ago, like this one. Compact to stay out of the wind, a stone wall topped with thatch and turf, and small enough to keep warm over winter. Excavations of Neolithic sites reveal very similar homes. The population largely sticks to the coastline, with a greater number of people in the low-lying Lewis, and the mountains of Harris and interior being sparsely populated. The population of the island at its height, 100 years ago or so, was over 20,000 for Lewis and 2,000 or 3,000 for Harris. Ancient monuments spanning thousands of years are also located in these more populous areas. These islands have gone through numerous physical transitions. When the first humans arrived, they encountered a post-glacial landscape, as nature returned and sea levels some 5 meters lower, allowing anyone to walk from one end of the Hebrides to the other. By the time the first farmers arrived, rapid sea level rise inundated the low, fertile coastline, and presents the islands as we see them today. The landscape was one of open woodland, the pioneering trees of birch and willow making way for hazel and Scots pine, and these were succeeded by ash and even oak, similar to the wild and sheepless slopes found on the mainland. The climate too has swung from warm and wet, as well as cooler and drier, and back to warm and wet periods. Soil and peat sampling reveals that for the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from 8 to 6,000 years ago, the climate was warmer and more pleasant. The Neolithic farmers arrived when it appears the Atlantic was stormier, but the good times continued with an increase in rain. This local climate change, at least local to northwestern Europe, switched back and forth every few generations over thousands of years. By 3,200 years ago, northern Europe entered a climatic period similar to today, in part to changes in the cycles of the Atlantic and the Arctic, but also farmers clearing away forest, either directly through felling and cultivation or livestock. This, in conjunction with wetter weather, led to the peat to blanket the landscape, the peat growing in thickness 1 millimeter every year. The rocky and shallow soils of the mountainous interior, even in Neolithic times, were not as important as machair. It's a Gaelic word meaning fertile plains. Machair is formed in the sea, sands pushed up onto the beach that contain a very high content of seashells, calcium carbonate. Anywhere from 20 to 80% shell fragments mix with the silicate sand, and this is unique to the western coastline. The links, for instance, on the east coast of Scotland being a much higher content of pure silicate sand and less fertile. The calcium carbonate sweetens the soil, making it more suitable for crops like oats, rye, barley, and grass for grazing. However, the free-draining nature and lack of clays means that it doesn't hold nutrients, and it's unsuitable in modern times for synthetic fertilizer. But seaweed applied as it has done for centuries retains the fertility. Neolithic farmers had no metals, so their plough was no more than a pointy stick, probably pulled by oxen, meaning they were unable to cultivate heavier soils for their crops. The machair, with a more temperate climate, was perfect, and evidently the community was successful enough to build their Callanish monuments. The Hebrides are not as rich in monumental buildings when compared, say, to the Boyne Valley in Ireland, or Sligo, or Orkney, which are similarly dated to around 5,500 to 5,000 years ago. But Callanish makes up for this. In the first instance, it's not just the main circle and avenue. It forms part of a larger monumental landscape. There are 4 additional stone circles, as well as standing stones and other alignments. What is noticeable is that Neolithic monumental complexes on the Scottish Islands are all different. This is the Isle of Arran. The multiple stone circles and standing stones and a tomb are all in very close proximity. Macklemore stone circles date from 4,000 years ago. They're younger than Callanish, but replaced older timber structures. On the Orkneys, the two stone circles are separated by the causeway between two lakes, with an associated settlement that was probably just for feasting in the middle. The Ring of Brodgar is younger than Callanish, but the stones of Stoness are older. And I wonder if there was some borrowing of architectural fashions going on. The stones of Orkney are sandstone, great slabs. The rocks of the Hebrides are Lewisian gneiss. That's an ancient granite that doesn't really come out of the ground flat. Yet it appears they have either selected stones or shaped them to mimic Orcadian stone circles. The discovery and ongoing excavations on Orkney are the Ness of Brodgar. The ceremonial centre, located between the stones of Stoness and the Ring of Brodgar, have revealed that we need to turn the map upside down and shrug off our south-centric view. The remote north was at this time the source of cultural energy. Grooved ware pottery, for instance, and stone circles started in the far north and spread south. And Callanish and the people of the Hebrides were very much part of this wider Neolithic society that stretched up from the coast of Cornwall to the Orkneys. A vibrant and industrious people building these mysterious complexes hundreds of years before the building of Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids. And connecting these communities was the sea. We overlook that these farmers were also proficient sailors and traders. As I said, we can only guess at the purpose of these stone monuments, but ultimately these centres were important in the day-to-day lives of these people. Successful Neolithic communities required the finest bloodlines of cattle, sheep and pigs, new bulls, rams and boars to keep their livestock, their lifeblood, and their communities healthy. And they would have also been seeking young, talented women to keep the human bloodline vibrant. The innovations in pottery and other crafts and their spread indicate women were very mobile. So perhaps monument building was the community showing off their success and having a location for other communities to come and bring livestock to exchange, to trade goods, as well as encourage new members to join. A kind of monumental advert. Their culture was dominant for 1,000 years, and then, around 4,200 years ago, a new culture arrived. The Bronze Age had begun and brought by a more warlike people that had grown out of the Eurasian steppes and established themselves first in Central Europe before migrating west about 4,400 years ago. When they arrived in the Hebrides, they continued to use Callanish, the tomb in the middle of the stone circle being constructed by them. The arrival of the Bronze Age in Britain is one of the most fascinating periods and the most confusing. In the first instance, the DNA record appears to show the Neolithic inhabitants to be almost completely wiped out. Over a few hundred years, 90% of the population was replaced. A number of possibilities have been suggested. Perhaps an ongoing pandemic within the Neolithic community, climate change and wetter weather that Neolithic farmers were unable to adapt to fast enough. Agricultural collapse due to farming methods and loss of woodland may have also been a cause. There is also the possibility of the Bronze Age people invading and subjugating the Neolithic farmers. One of the first uses of bronze is the sword. The problem is there simply is not enough evidence for conflict or mass graves. Bones don't survive well over that time period, and to compound matters, the Bronze Age Beaker people were quite good at preserving the bodies of the dead, with elites having their own grave, similar to the tomb and the centre of Callanish. In the Hebridean island of the East, mummified Bronze Age bodies have also been found. Perhaps it was a combination of problems, a perfect storm, that caused the demise of the first farmers. In the 14th century, we have a record of the worst century ever for Europeans. It started well with bumper harvests and population growth, But in 1315, the years without summer saw crop failures and societal collapse. 30 years later, the Black Death arrived, wiping out over half the population, and throughout, war rage everywhere. With fewer people, farmland was abandoned, and given the scale of this land use change, it also impacted on the climate. Even in the 19th century, the Outer Hebrides was subject to the same potato famine ravaging Ireland. The change from Neolithic to Bronze Age saw a change in agriculture, and it switched from mixed farming after the Neolithic to more pastoral livestock-dominated farming. They also did more hunting of deer. Incidentally, it seems that another benefit of island living was the absence of wolves and lynx and bears, as well as our wild cattle that lived on the mainland up until recent centuries. With climate change 3,000 years ago to a cooler and wetter period, and there's tree ring record in Ireland indicating years of no summers, the stone circles across Britain were abandoned. In the Hebrides, the peat expanded, and the landscape we are familiar with today developed. We can only imagine that lost vibrant civilization, and the lost fertile landscape they inhabited. But just as the stone monuments survive, so too there's the odd island of woodland, a memory of what went before. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this visit. Do check out the other videos on my channel, like, comment and subscribe.